Hi everyone, welcome back to Alice on the Giant Bookshelf. Today's video is my wrap up of everything I read in the month of April. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new. My name's Alice and I have way too many books. And for the month of April I actually have quite a jam-packed wrap up because it was definitely my most prolific reading month of 2024 so far. If you are new here, a very big welcome. The way I normally do my wrap-ups is that I talk about all of the books that I read from my roughly my least favourite to my most favourite, and at the end of the video we check in with my giant TBR numbers and see if my giant TBR has gone down instead of up, because for the first few months of the year it definitely went up. It finally started going back down in March, so fingers crossed that trend has continued into April. Before we do any of those things, we start off with a few stats about my reading in the month, and we will very briefly mention all of the books that I carried on from April into May. So stay tuned for all of that. The stats first. I actually read a whopping 17 books in the month of April, which was definitely my most of the year so far. My page count was not all that different from other months, so it was 4,489 pages according to Storygraph, and I think that the reason why this isn't higher is because some of those 17 books were poetry books. I did end up joining in with the poetry readathon, which was in like the last week of April, and I loved that. But some were poetry books which were very, very slim. Some were graphic novels and some were just really short books. Also, in addition to that, I did have 2 books that I DNFed, one of which was from my giant bookshelf. In terms of the books that I read, 2 of them were on audio this month. 2 of them were actually digital this month, which is unusual for me. I also read 2 books that were newly acquired this month, which will have a good effect on the TBR, hopefully. I read 7 library books. We are still in women's prize season. I am still borrowing an awful lot of library books, and I also read 4 books from my giant TBR. In terms of what I am still reading, it's gonna keep being the same book, but hopefully this will be finished by the end of May, and that is Ulysses by Joyce. This is my really big project of the moment, and I've been buddy reading this with Gemma from Gemma Books. If you haven't checked out Gemma's channel, you definitely should. I will link it down below. We do not always read things like Ulysses honest, and I don't think we ever will read something like Ulysses again, because this has been hard work. We're into the final part now, part 3. I am delighted that we are nearly at the end. Right at the end of the month, I started Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This was for Ben Reads Good's Read Good Challenge prompt for the month of April, which was to read a previous Women's Prize winner. This was the winner in 2021. I am a little way in. I'm really enjoying it, but I have had to put it to one side to finish a library book in time, so that's why that is still on the go. I also did start and not finish Mary Jean Chan's Bright Fear, which is a poetry collection, so I'll probably carry on dipping into that in May. I am still going with Dombey and Son, but I haven't read any more of it in April at all. I'm also still reading Thunderclap by Cumming, which is odd because I'm really enjoying that book. It is on the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction shortlist. This is the book that seems to have gone by the wayside all month while I pick up Women's Prize for Fiction reads. I really love it. I find the Dutch artists that Cumming is talking about very interesting, so I can't wait to finish that one. I'm also midway through a buddy read with Gemma from Gemma Books and Jack from Spread Bookjoy, which is an audio buddy read of Red Country by Joe Abercrombie, and we've been listening to all of Joe Abercrombie's first law books. This is the 6th one and I think our 5th one together, so Really, really enjoying being back in Abercrombie's world again. Let's talk about the books that I DNF'd. I don't often DNF books, but I had told myself that I could DNF books that were on the Women's Prize for Fiction list this year, because last year I didn't DNF any. I definitely had a bit of prize fatigue, which has definitely set in again this year. But I wasn't so successful with my DNFs, because I did say that if my DNFs came up in the shortlist, I would go back to them. So I have, alas, returned to 2 DNFs. In the month of April, I did DNF 2 books, and I did DNF 1 book, which I've since gone back to. First of all, from the Women's Prize, I DNF'd The Blue Beautiful World by Karen Lord. Still got my bookmark in this, but it is going back to the library after today, and I got to page 86. It's at least a third of the way through of this, getting on for halfway, but I just didn't really like this. There was nothing going on that was especially grabbing me or interesting me. I also think that this book was done absolutely no favours being put on a long list as a book that is not necessarily the third in a series, but is the third book to take place in the same world. I think I either should have started this series from the first book. I did get the first book out of the library, but I decided to take it back unread because I had a little look at that after DNFing this, and I just didn't think that it was for me. I also DNF'd a book from my own TBR, which I did get halfway through this one, I would say, and it's The Neon Rain by James Lee Burke. This is quite a famous crime fiction series following Dave Robichaux, and this is the first book in that series. I think I've already read the third one, which was called Black Cherry Blues, and I don't remember loving that one either. I think I could have finished this one and it probably would have been like a 2.5, 3-star book, but I'm not really too interested in slogging ahead with things that are only going to be like a 3-star maximum. The problem with this one was I really wasn't too interested in the case that was being investigated, which seemed to keep falling by the wayside, and by midway through this book it was clear to me that the character was going to be going down like a destructive path with addiction, and I just wasn't really wanting to read more of that. I read some of it and then I thought, if the rest of the book is going to be like this, I actually don't want to finish it. In large part, it's not down to the character of Dave Robichaux. I think he's very interesting, but I think that I didn't really love the style of writing here. Don't know if I will return to James Lee Burke, but if you have a favourite of James Lee Burke that you think I should try, do let me know. But this one will be getting unhauled from the giant TBR. I'd had it for probably about 14 years, so it's time to let go of that one. The third DNF of the month was Restless, Dolly, Maunder by Kate Grenville, and I've restarted this one because it's shortlisted for the Women's Prize. I'm on page 94. I'm still finding this to be quite a dull story. It does make me feel quite restless, ironically, but I will continue reading this because I do want to read all of the Women's Prize for Fiction shortlist. So at last, let's get on to some books that I actually did read, and we'll start with a book that I actually didn't like, and it's very, very rare for me to have a book that I didn't like in my wrap-up. It was The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. This is the first Philip K. Dick that I've read, and I mean, to be very honest, if his writing style is like this in all of his books, I don't think I'm probably going to seek any more of them out. I do have a short story collection on the TBR which contains Minority Report among others, and I probably will try that, but I just really didn't like the style of this at all. And the reason that this one got finished was because this was a buddy read with the lovely Berna from Berna's Bookish Adventures. I'll link her channel as well. You should definitely check it out and check out her review of this as well, which I'm sure will be very entertaining. Neither of us like this book. This is one of those books that just has such a good premise that I was just hugely disappointed when it didn't live up to that premise at all. Bern had watched the adaptation of this, which I hadn't, and said it was far better than actually reading the book. We read this quite slowly because we just couldn't read it any faster. It was really quite dull, lots of info dumps in my opinion. It's a book about America if the Nazis had won the Second World War and what that might look like. And to me, it doesn't really achieve any of the promise of that premise at all. This was on my 24 books to read in 2024, so I'm glad I did finish it, but it definitely wasn't worth the time invested in it. The prose is very, very dry. The characters, there are quite a few of them, and quite a few of them were completely uninteresting to me. There was one storyline that I was mildly interested in, and the way that ended was just a big letdown. This one didn't work for me. I thought that this dystopian society was going to be so interesting, but alas, it was not. Next up, we're going into my very good category, skipping the good category altogether. There were so many very good books that I read in the month of April, and I feel very lucky that I pretty much enjoyed, apart from The Man in the High Castle and the 2 DNFs, pretty much enjoyed everything that I read. So the first one I'm going to talk about was a digital read, and it was Garlic and the Witch by Bree Paulsen. I reviewed Garlic and the Vampire last month in my wrap up. My only real complaint about that book was that I was a bit weirded out by the way the characters were like living vegetables but were selling other vegetables to be eaten. So I found that concept really weird, but it really did resolve in the book Garlic and the Witch. All of that origin of these living vegetables was completely explained, and this was a nice cozy sort of middle grade graphic novel. It did what it set out to do and it was enjoyable. I like the art style in these two books, and I thought the story was quite charming. I was glad to know more about how these vegetable characters came to be. Again, it did go in a little bit of a weird direction, but I was okay with that. I think that the witch character is really, really interesting. So that was a good quick read, which I enjoyed. Next up, and there are quite a few books in this wrap up that I have individually reviewed. This is the first of those. I will link the individual videos in the description down below so that I don't go into them too much here. But Hangman by Maya Binyam was next. Still a book that I really don't know quite how I feel about it. Sometimes I think about this book and I think, what a weird book. I didn't really enjoy that. And other times I think, oh, that was like really quite clever. So yeah, this is a book that's definitely dividing opinion, and it even divides my own opinion basically. I did think that there were aspects of Hangman that were really, really funny, sometimes laugh out loud funny, and I also thought that there were aspects that were super strange, but it's the sort of book you have to read in its entirety to know what it's about. I'll leave you with that one, and if you want to check out my review, please do. Next up, we have Bridge to Terabithia by Catherine Paterson. This was the read for the book club that I host, FOMO Book Club, and we will be talking about this one on our live show on Friday on Jack's channel, so I won't go into it really here. I thought that this was an enjoyable enough book. It was very sad. It was not really as well written as I expected it to be, which sounds very critical, but I think I've just been spoiled by some really amazingly written middle grade books, and I thought that this one was a bit clunky in places, but that kind of fit with the narrator, I suppose. But I won't spoil our discussion on Friday. If you'd like to tune into that, I'll link it in the description box. Come and join us to chat everything about this, including spoilers. Next up, we have The Wren by Anne Enright. I am probably going to talk about this more in a Women's Prize vlog that I was attempting to film but I haven't filmed very much for. Another one of my women's prize reads. Probably won't do an individual review for this because I don't think I have enough thoughts to justify that, and I am a bit prize fatigued, as it were. This was my first Anne Enright, and I think that she is clearly a very skilled writer. You can tell that in this book. There are two main perspectives, one of which is a young girl called Nell, and she's sort of trying to find herself and having a bit of an abusive relationship. Her mother, Carmel, provides the other perspective. It's kind of a book about their mother-daughter relationship, in a way, and it's also very much has running through this the thread of Carmel's family, and in particular her father, who was a famous poet, and his poems run throughout this as well, which I think is impressive that Anne Enright has written all of this, including his poetry. So yeah, I thought the writing was great. I thought that this has, now it's ended up on the shortlist, has got a great chance of winning the prize, and I think if it does win, it will be based on the writing as opposed to the plot, because there really isn't too much plot to speak of, I would have to say. I have felt that this year's Women's Prize long list is a little bit lacking in plots, to be honest, and I didn't feel any different about this one. I enjoyed reading the vast majority of this, kept turning the pages, but there were parts where I was thinking, is anything going to happen in this? And I don't think anything really did develop. It's quite a quiet book. On a very sort of similar level, I would say Ordinary Human Failings by Megan Nolan. This one didn't make the shortlist, and I think that that's probably because we had 3 Irish writers all writing really amazing books on this year's Women's Prize long list, and this one is the one that didn't make the cut. I do think that that's a shame. I did find it very, very depressing, and I have recently reviewed this one individually. I don't think I gave a very good description of this in my review, to be honest, but at its heart it is about a family from Ireland who are living in London, and it delves into like their backstory and their secrets. It was a very, very compulsive read, even though it was making me very, very sad at the same time. This would be a perfect pick for Misery May if you're joining in that readathon, which is hosted by Gemma from Gemma Books and Scott from Gunpowder Fiction and Plot. I was a bit surprised that this missed out on being on the shortlist, but I'm sure we will hear more from Megan Nolan in the future. 8 Lives of a Century-Old Trickster was another Women's Prize one that I have reviewed individually, and I did enjoy this one a bit more than both The Wren and Ordinary Human Failings, but only marginally. I think that this is one of the ones that actually does have quite a strong plot, and in fact it had lots of different plots because it almost read like short stories that were interconnected, some less connected than others. I thought that the first half of this book was super, super strong, and I then think that the longer stories towards the end perhaps lost their way slightly, but it was still an enjoyable and compulsive read. One of my favourites that didn't make the cut for the Women's Prize shortlist. Coming on to a few very good books that I haven't reviewed anywhere else. The first of which is Beowulf, which is a very, very famous poem, and I read the translation by Seamus Heaney. This was translated from Old English or Anglo-Saxon. It's really interesting because it's kind of an epic poem about Beowulf and about his adventures facing several monsters, including Grenville. I wouldn't profess to have understood every single bit of this poem, but I thought Heaney did a good job in his introduction of talking through what the poem is about and talking through his process of translating it. And I also enjoyed that he sort of gave it a little gloss at the side that helped you to follow along with what was going on in the poem. That was really helpful. And yeah, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed my experience with this epic poem. This was a book that was acquired this month because in what happened to be Poetry Readathon week, I went out charity shopping with my mum and we spotted this in a charity shop. So I brought it home. Thanks Mum for buying me this, and I did get it finished by the end of the month, so that was good for not adding it to the TBR. I do think that this is a really interesting work to try if you like sort of mythology and things like that. This is kind of dealing with a Danish Scandinavian mythology, and I really liked it. Next up, a book I listened to on audio, and that was The Last Remains by Ellie Griffiths. This was the final book in the Ruth Galloway series. I'd been listening to it for a while, and I think this was a fitting end to the Ruth Galloway series, which has been 15 books in total, all of which I've listened to on audiobook, and I'm thinking of making a reader's guide to the Ruth Galloway series because it is one that I've enjoyed. It is a crime series. Ruth is a forensic archaeologist and helps the police out with their inquiries in the first book around bones. I think Ruth is an okay character in herself. She's quite interesting, but I really prefer the rest of the cast of characters who I find very interesting. I won't go into huge detail on this book because it is the 15th book in a series that I think you should read in order to appreciate the relationships between the characters and how they build, because it can be a little bit soap opera-ish at times. My main complaint with The Last Remains was that although I liked the nods to the previous books, I did think it spent a little bit too much time nodding towards the previous books, and I also felt very, very frustrated with two characters in particular, but it did come through with a good ending, and it also kind of did what this series has always done, which is always kind of nice in the wrap up to a series. So yes, mixed feelings about The Last Remains, but I did overall very much enjoy it, and this was a series I've loved listening to on audiobook. Next up is the book that I got with my mum for our sort of book subscription we're doing. I think this was the book that I got in February, and it's A Guest in the House by Emily Carroll, and this was a kind of a horror, and it is so interestingly illustrated because a lot of it is like black and white comic strip, and then some of it is really sort of fantastical and in colours, but mainly in the colours of red and sort of pink and blue and black. And I really did enjoy this. It's a very, very strange graphic novel, and I didn't know how to feel about it at all when I first finished it. It has a very incomprehensible ending. I spent quite a lot of time looking up how people think it ended, and I'm not sure if I agree with the opinions or not. It's the sort of thing where you have to kind of interpret for yourself, but I thought this was interestingly done, and it definitely has a lot of shades of Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, in that this is a book about a woman who is the second wife of her husband, and in this case she's living with the husband and also with a stepdaughter who has lost her mother. And as the title suggests, A Guest in the House, and I think that is multi-layered because I think that the protagonist, our sort of wife character, really does think of herself as like a guest in this house, but equally there is certainly mystery to this, and there is certainly things in the house going on that are maybe not quite as they seem. There is like ghost layers, there's fantastical layers in this, and there's definitely horror. It is quite sort of graphic and a bit startling at times in the drawings. So yeah, I really did enjoy this overall, and I definitely want to pick up Emily Carroll's other book, Through the Woods, which I believe is several connected stories in graphic novel form. Really off the wall, really different, but very much enjoyed. Next up, I'm going to talk about two books by the wonderful Jen Campbell, who also is a booktuber as well as an author, and I'm late to both of these books because one was her poetry collection, which was her first poetry collection, The Girl Aquarium, and I read Jen Campbell's most recent poetry collection, Please Do Not Touch This Exhibit, last year, and I had lots and lots of strong feelings about that one. It was a very, very special poetry collection. And I also very much enjoyed The Girl Aquarium. These two books are actually at the start of my very, very good category because I gave all of the books from here on in like 4.5 stars until we get to the favourites of the month. So these were super close to being favourites of the month. And the other one by Jen Campbell that I read in the month was her short story collection, The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night. So I'm going to talk about this one first, I think. I really liked this. I'm a fan of short stories and I'm a fan of sort of weird things and imagery. As I've noticed in Jen's other books, particularly the poetry, which went quite well with this, there are sort of sea themes in all of Jen Campbell's work. The story that I loved the best was called Jacob, and this took the form of a letter, and I thought it was really, really sweet. I also loved some really short stories in this. There was one called In the Dark, which was very mysterious, but I really, really liked it. I loved the title story. That was absolutely beautiful and really cleverly done and just very evocative. Really, really liked that. I also really enjoyed Margaret and Mary at the End of the World. I'm not going to go into more detail on any of the stories in particular because I feel that that would be to spoil this collection, but there were no stories that I disliked. I thought this was a very strong collection. Some were more exciting than others, but I absolutely loved my time reading this, which was a very short time because although I intended to kind of read a story at a time and sit with it and maybe continue this over like a week or so, I didn't do that. I completely binge read this and I don't regret that. I definitely would revisit it again. It was very, very interesting and enjoyable. The same could definitely be said for The Girl Aquarium. I had favourite poems in this. I think they were called The Bear, and I think one of those was called something like Into the Dark. I'll put the title up on the screen. Those were my favourites. I read this for the Poetry Readathon, and I haven't really fully mentioned that yet, but it was hosted for the last week of April by Charlie from Charlie Brooke Reads and Charlie from Charles Heathcote, and it was encouraging us to read poetry, and that was the collection that I read in full for this challenge, and I really, really enjoyed it. I think that Jen Campbell's themes and poetry just really, really interest me and really speak to me. And although I didn't love it as much as Please Do Not Touch This Exhibit, that was an absolute 5-star for me. These two were like close behind, but not absolute favourites. So really, really, really enjoyed those books. Next up we have If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin. This was my first James Baldwin and it was kindly sent to me by Gemma from Gemma Books. And I took my time reading this. This was the Read Good Challenge prompt for March, I believe. It was for the prompt of Oscars. This was turned into a film which was nominated for multiple Oscars and I think won some. It was my first experience of Baldwin, but it definitely won't be my last. I thought that this was a wonderful book. Not a book where huge amounts happen, but a book where you really care for the characters. In this one we're following a young woman called Tish as she relates the story of kind of the love of her life, Fonny, who is currently in prison, and we get hints of what they had in their relationship and what happened to Fonny, why he's ended up in prison as they try to get him out of prison. It very much centres around the experience of these two black families in New York. I thought that Tish's narrative voice was extremely believable and well written, and I just found all of the characters in this complicated and interesting, and the sense of injustice in these pages was just absolutely palpable, and I can't wait to read more James Baldwin. This was absolutely heartbreaking, but an absolutely wonderfully written story that I really wanted to take time over, and I'm glad that I did. read this slowly. The final book before we go into my favourites of the month is the latest volume that I read of the Saga series, which is created by Brian K. Vaughan, who writes it, and Fiona Staples, who illustrates. I really love this graphic novel series. I've been introduced to this by Gemma from Gemma Books, and I know she's a lot further ahead with this series than I am. I won't describe this in too much detail because it's the 3rd book in the series, and I think there are 11 books so far. I've already bought book 4 because I just really enjoyed this volume a lot. This one had a lot of action. I think I enjoyed it more than volume 2, probably about the same amount that I enjoyed volume 1, maybe even a little bit more. I love the illustrations. I think there are so many interesting characters in this, and we're really sort of following a couple who belong on different sides in like an interplanetary war, and their child who is telling us the story even though she's a baby. I think that all 3 of them I'm hugely invested in already, even though I've only read 3 volumes. Can't wait to read some more. Can't recommend Saga highly enough. If you are a fan of sort of sci-fi fantasy hybrids and graphic novels, then this is probably for you. Into my favourites of the month, I had 3 5-star reads this month, and all of them were absolutely excellent. But the one I'm going to talk about first is How to Say Babylon by Sophia Sinclair, and this is currently shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction. I think it will probably win the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction because this is a really powerful memoir. Sophia Sinclair is a poet, and I would really like to now read her poetry, and this memoir looks at her life growing up in Jamaica, growing up living with her father who is Rastafari. This is a difficult memoir to read in places. I listened to it on audiobook, and I did find it hard sometimes to be listening to it because it does have very distressing content and very difficult themes are discussed. At all times this was done in a very lyrical and poetic way. You can feel Sinclair's love for Jamaica, her love for her siblings and her mother, and you can really feel her love for poetry. The way she poetically describes Jamaica and the landscape and the sea is just absolutely beautiful. I thought that this is just so well written and so moving and emotional, and that's the reason why I think this will probably go on to win the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction. I felt like I learnt a lot from this book about the Rastafari religion and way of life, and I think that this is an absolutely fascinating read. A book that I also absolutely loved, in fact I loved even more, that will not sadly be winning the Women's Prize is this one, In Defence of the Act by Effie Black. This was a really devastating look at a really serious topic. This is from the Women's Prize for Fiction, by the way, but it didn't get longlisted. This remains my favourite on the list so far, and that was because I really enjoyed following the main character, Jessica Miller, and I've made a whole review video of this one if you want to know my thoughts in full. And then my absolute favourite of the month, which has alas gone back to the library, is Everyone on This Train is a Suspect by Benjamin Stevenson. I also have a solo review of this one, but it was the follow-up book to a brilliantly funny crime book that I read last year, Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone. I've reviewed that as well. All of these separate videos will be linked down below, but suffice it to say, I absolutely loved being on a train with so many suspects, and in particular our main narrator, who was also the narrator of the first book and is just a brilliant writer character to follow. Love this, a great mystery, and the first mystery in absolutely years that I've given 5 stars to. So I think that that is probably heading up the pack as my favourite book of the year so far, but there is obviously stiff competition from the other 5-star reads that I have had. So that brings us to the end of all of the books that I read in April, and all that remains is to check out how the numbers are doing with the giant TBR. I finished the month of March on 151 books, and I was very hopeful that in April I might finally get back below 150, where I started the year, and stay there this time. I did acquire 2 new books in the month, but that was Saga Volume 3, which I read, and Beowulf, which I read, so that stays at 151 books. I then DNF'd 1 book from the giant TBR, which takes us down to 150 books. And I then read 4 books from the giant TBR, which were A Guest in the House, The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night, If Beale Street Could Talk, and The Man in the High Castle. That brings us down to 146 books. Yay! I am really pleased with that. I was participating in the TBR Clear Out, which was a readathon hosted by Katie from Books and Things. One of the challenges for that was to set your own goal, and I wanted to read 5 to 6 books from the giant TBR. Technically, including this one which I picked up and only read half of, I did get to 5 books, so I'm not too displeased with that. I'm very, very glad the TBR is down below 150 books at last. That's all for today. Thanks for joining me for my wrap up of all the books I read in April. Do let me know in the comments, what were your favourite books that you read in April? Did you have any books that you DNF'd, or was it all good books? If you have enjoyed this video today, please do give it a like, and please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. If you don't have a comment to leave today, I would love it if you left me an emoji for one of these books that you thought sounded interesting. Thanks for watching, and I will hope very much to see you all again very soon for another video all about books here on Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Bye for now.